Welcome, everybody, to this week's episode of the Yes Labels podcast. Sorry, I'm Justin Clark, here with Bill Stepien. Say hello, Bill.
Hello, Justin.
Before we get started, as always, if you like our podcast, follow it, share it with your friends, like it, do whatever you need to do, subscribe to it. It's the most important thing you can do today, for us anyway. Kind of an interesting week. We are at the official beginning of this 2023 election year. There are some elections that we have coming down the pike, and it is post Labor Day, and this is when all the stuff heats up for the 2023 election. But we are looking at the 2024 race, and we had some news coming out this week. Bill, everyone's throwing messages around and looking at poll numbers.
Jim Messina, I thought we should spend a little time talking about his PowerPoint analysis that he issued this week. No one loves a good PowerPoint more than me. Jim Messina was on the 2008 Obama campaign, worked in the Obama White House, then moved over to run the Obama reelect in 2011. I'm very jealous of the time he had to plan that campaign, as opposed to someone who, like me, parachuted in with 120 days left in the campaign. So the lead time and the prep time he had to get the campaign right was a luxury we weren't afforded. But still, this week he issued a 20-ish slide PowerPoint that he called let me pull it up, the 2024 General Election State of Play, close quote. And he jumps into where he thinks the Biden administration is at. He analyzes the Republican primary, and then he begins to look at the 2024 general. I think we spent a lot of time on this podcast, Justin, analyzing the Republican state of play, rightfully so. Not only because there isn't a ton of movement at the top of the Republican primary right now. I think it's still a one-man race. I think it makes some sense to spend some time discussing how Jim Messina and the Democrat side, how they're viewing the 2024 race. I'm not sure how you feel about it, Justin. It got some coverage this week, which is why I think it makes some sense to take a look at it here. I'm not sure how you feel about it. There are a few things I agree with, some things I'll disagree with. What did you think?
Well, I think that the Biden administration is freaking out a little bit because they are getting pressure from donors, activists, their overlords in the media about some bad poll numbers that are coming out for President Biden right now. He is in a tie or losing in most major national polls to former President Trump, which is a real problem for him. And I think Jim Messina, who's, as you mentioned, Barack Obama's 2012 campaign manager, was asked to put together a memo to calm people down. And I think that's what this was. And I think as far as that went, if that was his goal, he probably did an okay job. You can only distort reality for so long, though. So I'm not sure it changes anything fundamentally about the race. But make no mistake, that is 100% what this was.
There are a few premises that he lays out in the PowerPoint. I thought it would make some sense to go through some number of them, 5 or 6 of them, one by one, and let's just dig in a little bit into our view of his theory of the case. And then at the end, he actually begins to lay out some pathways to victory for Biden. I don't want to look at the pathway to 270 map right now, but I do think it makes some sense to go through state by state and begin to give some thought on the state of play in each battleground. So if you're good with that, we can dive in. And I'll start, Justin, by throwing it to you. Premise number 1, he states his words, with 14 months until the general, Biden is in a better position now, is in a better position than most people realize. Agree with that? Disagree with that? What do you think?
Well, I disagree with it because, first of all, again, this is a messaging document, so it's just full of conclusory statements without much data to back it up. He's ignoring kind of the big elephant in the room, meaning the reason why he's doing this memo in the first place, which is national polling, which the two major polls over the last 60 days, the New York Times Siena poll, NBC News Wall Street Journal poll, and just yesterday, a CNN poll that came out showing the race between former President Trump and President Biden tied. Not essentially tied, not within the margin of error tied. And if you are a Democrat and you are looking at this race, you should be only comfortable in a position where you are up significantly. Well, you and I both know, a lot of you listeners know, that if a race is tied nationally between a Republican and a Democrat because of the way the electoral college works, that means the Republican is effectively winning the race. And that's a real problem. I think those last several polls, and it's not something new here, are hard to explain away, and that's what this memo tried to do. So, is he in a better position than most people realize? I think that is a wildly defensive statement for him to make. Hey, everybody, I know these polls look terrible, but here's why we're going to win, and we're in a really good position. They are slowly losing each of their rationale for a candidacy against Donald Trump. Obviously, the polling indicates that these indictments that Biden's Justice Department has brought against Donald Trump aren't having any political impact whatsoever. Other issues that we're going to get into later he's not able to really drive a wedge through those at this point. And so premise one is just a lot of conclusory statements that ignore the facts in the polling data. And again, this memo was a reaction to Democrats freaking out about a race that is essentially tied. And I think Democrats are waking up to the fact that 2016 was one of the closest elections in history when Donald Trump beat Hillary Clinton. And they're waking up to the fact that 2020 was actually closer. People don't like talking about that, but it was actually closer than 2016. And we're in for another super close race again in the rematch between Donald Trump and Joe Biden. What do you think, Bill?
This is a document that speaks to the base. You mentioned today is September 8th. So September 7, CNN released the poll that you referenced. In that poll, 67% of Democrats and Democrat leaners said their party should nominate someone other than Biden. That is alarming, right? This is a document that is not trying to appeal to or speak to independents, people in the middle, people in the suburbs, people that you need to win again. This is a document that's speaking to the base. And look, as someone who sat in the campaign manager's chair, you are constantly trying to get your side of the story told, right? That's easy if you're in a good political position. If you're not in a good, enviable political position, the harder you have to spin, the harder you have to sell, the harder you have to try and make your case to the media to get better coverage, to donors to keep the dollars flowing, to the base to keep them energized, even to your candidate and staff, right? To keep their heads in the game. That's the purpose of this presentation. This is a document of spin more than analysis, in my estimation.
Totally. And you referred to it as a memo before, but that's kind of like referring to a Coleman stove as like a wolf range. So let's just be diplomatic. This is not a memo. This is an advertisement in PowerPoint. So the next thing he hits is that he said, and you can see this in the Biden messaging coming from a million miles away. Again, a lot of doors are closing to them in terms of issues. But he makes the statement that the economy is strong and the Biden team is working to ensure voters feel that way. What do you think of that, Bill?
Premise number two, Joe Biden is trying to tell Americans that the sky is green, right? It's not true, and voters aren't buying it. That same CNN poll from yesterday, 58% of Americans think Biden's policies, no one else's, have made the economy worse. Only 24% think his policies have made things better. And that's the worst. Most importantly, that's the worst number for Biden on that question since he took office, and it's 8 points worse than last fall. So it's bad and it's getting worse. The biggest issue here, and it's not just this presentation, it's not just this analysis, it's the Biden administration as a whole. They're trying to tell voters how to feel, and you get in trouble when you try to do that. You need to be reaffirming what people already know. And too few Americans believe what Joe Biden is trying to sell them right now. What they should be doing, which we know, is they should be trying to mechanically fix what's wrong with the economy, right? And we know that he doesn't have the political ability in his party or the political courage to do things that economically would make sense from a policy perspective, reducing demand by cutting spending, or going back to the Trump era energy policies. Look, the problem with Biden's salesmanship is this isn't the stock market, right? Where half of Americans own stock and even fewer check in on how things are going every day or every week. The average American's at the grocery store twice a week. And every time they go, they're slapped in the face with a reminder that what Joe Biden is trying to sell them is wrong. But they don't see it, they don't feel it, they know it's not true. And that's a big problem for Joe Biden. He's trying to tell Americans how to feel, and they don't feel that.
I agree. Voters aren't stupid. And I think political consultants and political candidates get in trouble when they think they can message their way out of an issue. I have real concerns about what they're doing for two reasons. One, they're really owning the economy right now. Okay? And sometimes I think on both sides of the aisle, policymakers that are in positions of power in the White House think they can just turn the dials, turn a screw here or there. They can make a regulatory change, and voila, the economy improves. The White House has much less control over these things. The government has much less control over these things than a lot of times they realize. And sometimes politicians start sniffing their own farts a little bit too much and think that they can control these things. So they're owning
Justin,
this.
I used to, whenever President Trump used to, pound his chest about the stock market, for the same reasons you just said, I used to just cringe a little bit. Like we don't control that, right? Like our policies are helping feed the result, but a lot of that's out of our control.
But yes, but they're owning it right now. They've even branded it Bidenomics, and we're over a year out from the election, and they have no idea, A, what the economy is going to be like, and B, how it's going to be impacting regular people. I will say this, excuse me, there are emotional parts of the economic argument that they can make, which in some cases can work, but only if voters are concerned about it at the time. So some of their drug pricing stuff is interesting, and they can make an emotional appeal on that. The problem they've got is they're running against a guy, Donald Trump, who isn't a doctrinaire conservative with respect to healthcare policy and certain economic policies. So those arguments work less on him than almost anyone else. So I think this notion that they're going to own the economy is really TBD whether it works or not. Okay, TBD whether the economy's good and voters give credit to Biden or not. But to own it this early and to make appeals like that really reeks of not understanding that they have less control than they think they do.
Couldn't agree more. Premise number 3, the GOP electorate leans Trump, but is still potentially up for grabs. What you think?
I think this was really stupid and a stupid notion. The Donald Trump will get 90 to 95% of Republican voters in the general election in 2024. Period. Full stop. There is no differentiation. We saw this in 2016, Bill. We would see in polls over and over again that there was some uneasiness with Donald Trump in 2016 among traditional Republican voters. That never manifested itself in 2016. By 2018, he had a hammerlock on the Republican Party. Today, his favorability among Republicans is through the roof and has remained so for quite some time. Those voters are not up for grabs for Joe Biden. They just aren't. People in this economic environment are putting their jersey on and going out and voting if Donald Trump is the nominee. The Democrats should be more worried about losing some Democrats than Donald Trump should be worried about losing any Republicans.
2020 exit polling, Biden and Trump each got 94% of their party's vote, 94-6. 2016, those numbers were exactly the same. It's what happens in an election, right? Republicans vote for Republicans, Democrats vote for Democrats. The difference between the 2 years was that Trump won independents by 4 in 2016. Biden won by 13 in 2020. So, and by the way, you saw a messier Democrat primary in 2020 than you're seeing in the Republican primary this time around. You know, what happens in the fall? The leaves change, football starts, and everyone comes back around to vote for their party's candidate. It's what happens. The only impact, I guess, could be on turnout, but it won't be in how people are voting when they're at the ballot box.
And you and I both know turnout in a presidential cycle is going to be through the roof,
Yep.
Especially for Republicans who, and you and I will talk about this more in a later episode, Republicans are now the party that has turnout problems in off-year elections and is going to overperform in presidential years. It's flipped from what the conventional wisdom is. But anyway, we'll talk about that some other point. So the next premise he brings up is the misery index, which, quote, predicts winners, close quote. He's really relying awfully heavily on the misery index. Bill, why don't you tell everyone what the misery index is, first of all, because that's just a whole other thing that the fact that we have to explain it to everybody is telling. But also, what do you think about that statement?
If I had economics classes in college, I would have been asleep in them. It's the combination of unemployment and inflation. That's what this index is, which in my eyes is some made up metric that I think I referenced. It's like when a sports agent is trying to negotiate a contract for their athlete, and they walk into a meeting with the team owner with some made up stat that talks about how great their client was for what great performance their player, their client performed for the team. It's a made up stat. I mean, let's look at unemployment just the last few years. January and February of 2020, the re-election year of Trump, it was at 3.5%. COVID hits, balloons to double digits, 15% almost in April of 2020, gets back down under 7% by election day 2020. Continued to decrease throughout 2021, got to under 4 by the end of 2021. And it's been under 4 since. I think right now it's just under 4% at 3.8%. They talk a lot about the misery index for Biden being similar to Obama's reelect, to Clinton's reelect, to Reagan's reelect. But the numbers, when you look under the hood, are very, very different, right? We said that unemployment right now is 3.8%. In October of 2012, Obama's reelection year, the month before he was reelected, unemployment was 7.8%, and inflation was just 2.2%. So the numbers have essentially flipped, right? Under Obama, unemployment was higher, inflation was lower. Under Biden, unemployment is lower, inflation is much higher. The issue I have with this made up stat, this made up metric, is that unemployment impacts the less than 4% of people who don't have a job right now. But inflation, which is much higher, impacts everyone. And when you combine the numbers like they do in this air quotes misery index, you paper over the inflation numbers you want to hide, right? It's like when my wife tells me
Be careful.
how much the credit card bill.
Be careful.
I know. It's like when she tells me what the credit card bill was for the month, and she combines the groceries with the new dress she bought at the mall, right? You don't want me to see the amount you spent on the dress, so you combine it with the groceries. That's why Biden, and in this presentation, Messina keeps pushing this made-up stat, because they know inflation is bad, and it's something people see every single day. So they paper over what they don't want you to see by combining it with something else. That's what I think, Justin.
Yeah, and look, I was an economics major in college, and
oh boy,
I understand like some of this stuff and have gone through it, but most economic statistics that aren't a derivative of, well, actually all of them are somewhat made up. So I get what I get what he's trying to do here. I get it. The problem he has, well, two things. First, getting back to the previous point, this is like, as our friend Larry Kudlow would say, like some old Phillips curve mentality. Like this looks at the interplay between unemployment and inflation, which is the Phillips curve, which just isn't there. There's very little causation between adjusting the two. So I think looking at this metric too closely is really that old Phillips curve mentality. Turn the dials, we can fix this, and you just it doesn't work. There's no correlation between the two. More importantly, the date today is September 8th, 2023. Okay, if we go back to September 2019, the misery index was 5.211. Today it's 6.678. Let's talk about what the misery index is at the time of the election. Okay, in April of 2020, that misery index shot up over 15 points. That was the height of COVID. And in November of 2020, it was at 7.875 when the election occurred in 2020. Okay. Talking about that and looking at those numbers, there's no real correlation between a win and a loss. 2020 was a margin of error election. It was a margin of error election. And the misery index was a tick higher than it is now. And by the way, if we compare apples to apples, in September of 2019, the misery index was lower than it is today. So maybe this statistic matters. Maybe it doesn't. I don't think it does. But if you're going to do it, you have to compare apples to apples, because the misery index at the time of people actually voting probably matters more. And again, look, I don't want to dig on Jim Messina too much. I think he probably knows this. This is a messaging document. This is a, hey, everybody, don't freak out document. I get it. But it's really just a statistic that is meaningless over a year out from the election.
Let me give you one more premise, then we'll get into some state-by-state analyses. Fifth premise, last premise. Abortion access remains a key motivating issue. What do you think?
I think he's wrong about that. I think a lot of the takeaways from the 2022 election were related to abortion access and to Dobbs and that decision. But he's making a conclusory statement here without any evidence to support it. Abortion right now is not an animating issue. If you look at the NBC, the Wall Street Journal poll from August 24th through the 30th, abortion ranks at 8% among registered voters in terms of, the question was, what issue is most important to you when thinking about who you'll vote for in the 2024 presidential election? It was at 8% in August 2023, behind the economy and immigration. Immigration among registered voters. That's down 3 points. Abortion is down 3 points from their April 23 poll, and immigration is up 5 points. Okay, so in terms of an issue overall that's a concern to voters, it's not right now. Not right now. It's just above global warming and preserving democracy. It's not registering. Now, like I said, people cite 2022 as an example. But as we've said before, where it was on the ballot, it mattered. Where it wasn't, it didn't. Right? That's the Michigan versus New York model. In Michigan, it was on the ballot. It drove people to the polls in an off-year election in 2022. And in New York, it didn't. It almost actually cost the Democrats the election by running on it. But this is a presidential year. We're going to have nearly 100% turnout, and it's not, and this is the important part, it's not a partisanized issue. Here's what I mean by that. If you look at the Ohio vote last month on that the Democrats turned into basically a referendum on abortion in terms of their ballot proposition, this isn't an issue that animates one party or another. This is an issue that crosses party lines. So there's no real correlation between someone showing up and voting for a more pro-choice ballot initiative or candidate and still voting Republican or Democrat later. There's a lot of studies to be done, but you just look at the polling on this and you look at who turned out to vote, and it's not a partisan issue. It's not, I guess what I'm saying is it's not creating Democrat votes for Joe Biden. And voters in favor of abortion rights, where it will be on the ballot in 24, and it could be Arizona, which we talked about, which is something that Messina talks about. Voters are going to split their votes. People like to cite the 2004 Bush reelect with gay marriage as an animating issue that's akin to what abortion is right now. And in some states, it turned voters out. But who did it turn out? It turned out voters who weren't typically going out and voting anyway. Evangelical voters in specific states who weren't voters before that. This isn't going to drive new voters to the polls or create Democrats. Again, voters are smarter than people think they are. And this as an animating issue to put Joe Biden over the top doesn't make a ton of sense to me. And look, the media loves keeping it real for pro-abortion politicians and making this an issue. There's kind of this weird Democrat/media obsession with sex and abortion and all these kinds of issues. But I don't know how he can draw that conclusion again in a conclusory statement without any supporting facts. And I'm just not willing to go there yet as it being an animating issue among Democrats. Bill, what do you think?
I mean, I'll go back to the CNN poll I cited earlier in this conversation. 2/3 of Dems and Democrat-leaning voters think the party should nominate someone else, someone other than Biden. So in my eyes, they're going to need all the help they can get in trying to get their base energized behind November's election. I know turnout's going to be higher, but we did see differences in turnout in places like Pennsylvania last time around, increased from the previous presidential election. So I think this is a case where you're going to have the Democrat side, right? Not just the Biden campaign, but you're going to have all hands on deck in trying to pitch in to get people motivated to support, vote, turn out next November. Because right now there's not a lot of energy behind the guy. I know people, and we said they come around because that's what happens in the fall. But I mean, when you have 2/3 of your party looking for somebody else, that's a problem.
And I think that's a really smart point. My only issue with that, Bill, is they're assuming that those votes are going to translate to Biden votes, right? I don't know if they can count on that. I mean, we saw it in 2012 when you had a lot of voters show up in places like Ohio and just not vote for president because Obama did such a good job of dismantling Mitt Romney. He was unacceptable to people who would traditionally have been Republican voters, and they didn't vote for that thing, but they voted for everything else. That's a real possibility here because I think they have to make that connection. They have to draw that line in a way that works. And I'm not sure if it's a Biden-Trump contest, they can necessarily do that, but TBD. But either way, he's making a conclusory statement. We know who the audience is. It's Democratic donors and activists who are freaking out. And I get what he's doing. I'm just not sure I agree with his conclusion.
We talk about some, he goes through and presents, I think, 4 different pathways to victory for Biden. I think it's a little early to be talking about math to 270, but he does list out some of the battleground states. I thought it makes some sense just talking through our view of the current state of play, our way too early projection about where we think things might go next November. You okay with that?
Yeah, let's do it.
You want to talk, Gary? You want to go alphabetical order, starting with Arizona?
Yeah. Well, I want to start with an overall
Okay.
notion.
Okay.
I don't think
Start with the overall notion.
I don't think Joe Biden is going to win any state he lost in 2020. So starting there, there's not a state that he did not win in 2020 that he's going to win in 2024 at this point in time. That's just not in the cards. They'll talk about some states and probably spend a lot of money in some states, but just based on things that are happening. So that's my worldview. Jumping into Arizona, my thought on Arizona is still a nominally Republican state in terms of voter registration and who's there. It's had a lot of breaks in the party over the last couple cycles, which have really hurt Republicans. There's the lack of unity and unity of purpose going back for I say a couple cycles, going back for a pretty long time, has really hurt Republicans in the state of Arizona. That said, again, it still is a marginally Republican state, and I would anticipate Arizona being tight as a tick again, like it was in 2020. What do you think, Bill?
Yeah, I think a lot of the 2020 battleground states and 2024 battleground states and probably battleground states moving forward from there for the foreseeable future, a lot of them have been changing for quite some time. And I think everyone points the finger at Donald Trump and says, you caused this. You're the reason why Georgia is now a battleground. You're the reason why Arizona is a battleground when it wasn't before. But these states have been changing for decades. And did Trump put rocket fuel in the change? Maybe. But, Arizona, I went back and looked. In 1990, it's forever ago, I get it, right? But 28% of Arizonans were people of color, Latinos, Blacks, Asian Americans, Native Americans, 28%. Now it's almost 50%. It's 47%. That's a different state, right? White voters over that same time went from 78%, almost 8 in 10, to 53%, just about half. So the state's been changing.
Well, and that coincides with the parties changing. I mean, again, it's still a marginally Republican state, and you're starting to see race matter less as an indicia of how you're going to vote than it has before. So it's all kind of mixed up in the pot right now, and it's interesting to watch.
And to your point about this race being tight again in 2024, the race in Arizona in 20 came down to precincts, right? 98 precincts were flipped from Trump in 16 to Biden in 20. That's 98 precincts. We're talking about a statewide race that came down to a couple precincts here. And we all, exactly. And by the way, every one of those precincts that flipped, they voted for Sinema over McSally in the 2018 U.S. Senate race. So these were all already swing precincts, probably lean Democrat precincts, by the way. It's going to be tight again because I think that's what Arizona is now. It's a changed state, and it's going to be tough and tight again.
Yeah, I agree.
You want to talk? Georgia next?
Yeah, I mean Georgia, I think since 2020 has been pretty interesting. We've got the same sort of dynamic going on in Arizona, but with a caveat, right? It's a state that is changing, I think, less dramatically than Arizona. But you've got again, nominally Republican voting bloc that is willing to deviate from the party vote and the kind of party line to vote for somebody else. You saw Herschel Walker lose, but Brian Kemp win by a gazillion votes. You see,
and hold on, like Herschel Walker losing by 2.5 points, like that tells you how competitive the state is.
Yeah,
because Herschel Walker was not setting any world on any fire.
Well, let's just talk about this. I mean, if you go by the Cook PVI, Georgia's a R+5 state. North Carolina's an R+5 state. Ted Budd won that race in North Carolina, getting outspent a lot to not a lot, and kind of cruised to victory. It wasn't super close. And Herschel Walker loses that race. There's a candidate issue there, a campaign issue there. There are certain things going on. And the Warnock campaign was really well. But just think about this for a second. How many Kemp Warnock voters there were? That's pretty incredible.
Mm-hmm.
So that split ticket dynamic is what's going on in Georgia. I actually think the Biden campaign is going to have to do more work in Georgia than they did in 2020 because now he's got a record. I think more Republican-minded independents are going to be willing to take a second look at Donald Trump. I think some of the issues that existed there in terms of dynamics with the party may not exist anymore. And I think you've got 2022 was probably the worst thing that happened to President Biden in Georgia because it got a lot out of the system of Republican voters in the state. And I think a relatively drama-free campaign in Georgia, running a meat and potatoes, hardcore Republican race, Donald Trump, I think, has a very good chance of winning Georgia.
Not dissimilar from Arizona. It's changed a lot over the last 20, 25 years. I mean, since 2016 alone, there have been 1 million new registered voters, about 2/3 of which are minorities, half of whom were under the age of 35, not necessarily the Republican Party base these days. So, again, Atlanta's been growing like a weed over the last, couple decades. Now it's 2/3 of the entire state's population. So it's a different state than it used to be. I'll also note Biden's approval in Georgia right now is 42%. It's 40% in Arizona. So, I mean, those are not numbers that are particularly strong at this point in the administration.
If you're under indexing, it's tough in states because the surveys aren't going to be exactly the same. But if you're under indexing your national approval rating in a swing state, that's not a good sign. He needs to be over that number because you're going to have very partisan states dragging him down and picking him up. So he needs to, in those states, his approval rating, his image rating needs to over-index what you're seeing nationwide. All right, Michigan. What do you think of Michigan, Bill?
We very early on in the 2020 cycle, we both agreed that Michigan would be the easiest state that the Democrats lost in 2016 to win in 2020. You and I talked a lot about Wayne County, home of Detroit, being an easy fix for the Democrats. It was a complete campaign flub by the Clinton campaign to not pay even minimal attention to turning out Wayne County. And it cost her the race. Obama won Wayne County by a margin of 382,000 votes. Clinton's margin was just 289,000. That's a difference of 93,000 lost votes for Clinton in a state that she lost by 12,000 votes in 2016. You and I both said you pay any attention to Wayne County in 2020 that Clinton didn't pay in 2016, that state's going to flip back, and it did. I think Michigan is a state that's hard for Republicans. I'll know, related to that, Obama or Biden's approval is 44% in Michigan. I think Michigan's a hard state for Republicans. What do you think?
I agree, but with a slight caveat here. I think Biden will not win Michigan by more than he won it or by as much as he won it in 2020. Two things are at play here, I think. There's a real chance that Democrats learned the wrong lesson from 2022 in Michigan. It's one of the states I cited where abortion was on the ballot in 2022. It's not anymore. That's going to be a harder sell message-wise for people to win. I think the Trump campaign should be playing in Michigan. I think they should be doing what they do in Michigan because I think there's a chance that the Democrats mess Michigan up again. There's a chance. I'm not saying they will, but we have seen the Biden camp really take for granted that a lot of things that are happening and missing a lot of messages and doing things that aren't correct and drawing conclusions that are not quite right. I think there's a chance they do that again in Michigan. I think things can happen in Michigan based on the performance of the Biden team so far. And it bears watching. I think the Democrats are going to take for granted their margin from 2020. And like I said, I think they are going to misread 2022 in a way that's going to hurt them. That said, all the things I'm talking about right now require the Democrats to mess something up. But either way, the margin's less for Democrats in 2024 than it was in 2020, and it bears watching. Hard state to win.
I think that's right. And listen, as much as I am a little down on the state right now, Trump lost it by less than 3 points.
Right.
In 2020. So with a lot of things not in his favor, 2.8%, still close. So still winnable.
Mm-hmm.
Nevada. What do you think about Nevada?
Nevada is an interesting state. It is a state that has a lot of people moving in and out constantly moving in and out. So the makeup of
40% of 40% of the people who moved into Nevada last year were from California.
Yeah. And so the partisan makeup changes pretty consistently. The voting patterns change. It's always a close state. I will say, people always talk about Trump underpolling in the Midwest, where he always overperforms what the polls are. In the Trump era, 16, 18, 20, we have seen him and other Republican candidates underperform polls in Nevada and Arizona, which is just an interesting dynamic. So polling can just be a little wonky in that state. That's indicative of nothing. I think Nevada is a winnable state for Donald Trump. I think he fits that electorate. I think he fits the large Hispanic population, particularly male, in Nevada. And I think it's a state that can be won. We saw the governor's race. It was the only Republican governor's pickup in 2022. Joe Lombardo won. The right message. I think it's a state you have to play in, and I think it's a state that Donald Trump can win. We know that Democrats have a machine politics mentality, especially in Clark County, which is Las Vegas, the culinary unions, and those things work until they don't. So, and the margins are so close. I'm bullish on Nevada, and I think it's a state Donald Trump could potentially pick up. What do you think?
I'm a little less so, just given the changed rules in the state, right? We know that late in 2022, the legislature passed and the governor signed a bill that gave mail-in ballots to all active registered voters. And
2020,
also,
late in 2020.
Right. So I thought I said 20. Late in 2020. I think it was like a midnight vote on a weekend. It was something under cover of darkness, right? Also allowed and officialized ballot harvesting in the state. So when you talk about the machine nature of politics, ballot harvesting is a big deal to allow that machine to, be able to execute on something that requires a machine to do. And it certainly made 2020 harder. That which was passed in 2020 was temporary. It became permanent after 2020. So I just worry about the mechanics of the state and some of the inherent advantages that Democrats have, given the machine they have, the rules that are now bent in their favor. But again, it's going to be a contest again. It was a race that was a 2-point race in 2020. Very similar, almost on the button of what the 2016 presidential race was, 2.4 points each race. So tight, contested. I think the Democrat machine kind of slows down a little bit year by year, as Harry Reid is less of a his machine is less of a presence with each election year. But I'm a little less bullish on Nevada, just given the changing state, which is a constant churn. To your point, we know where these people are coming from. They're not Republican strongholds as they move in, and the changed rules, I think, just really put the Republican Party at a disadvantage.
Yeah, I agree.
New Hampshire. Any thoughts on New Hampshire?
I think New Hampshire
you
is
New Englander. You?
Yeah. Well, New Hampshire is New Hampshire, along with Virginia, I would say, are two states. We talk a lot about the shifting nature of the Republican electorate and the Democratic electorate. New Hampshire and Virginia are two states that typify the shift away from Republicans to Democrats. It's overwhelmingly white. It's pretty highly educated. It's not particularly religious, and it has relatively high incomes. It's a state moving away from Republicans consistently. They've elected a Republican governor there. I think there's opportunities there. I think it's a really tough state for any Republican at the top of the ticket to win. And if of the states we're going to look through and talk about, I'm least bullish on New Hampshire.
I don't even know why New Hampshire is included on the list of swing states anymore. I mean, it's not the 1990s anymore. Since 1992, New Hampshire has voted Democrat for president every election except 2000, 7 of the last 8. So, if you're,
and I think people look at it and it's a little bit of fool's gold that the legislature and the governor's office are Republican right now. And I mean, New Hampshire has like the 4th largest democratically elected legislature in the world. There's over 400 people, I think, in it. So you've got a lot of like little hamlets that are allowed to elect people, and the Republicans that they elect governor are pretty moderate and don't necessarily reflect national Republican views. So I wouldn't even get included on this list. I'm not sure why he did.
Not a swing state. We should stop talking about it. No more time spent on it. North Carolina.
Yeah, look, I said at the top, Joe Biden's not going to win any states that he lost in 2020, and North Carolina is one that they're going to spend a lot of time and money trying to win, and they're not going to do it. North Carolina is a Republican state. When Obama won it in 2008, everyone looked at it as if, wow, we can unlock the door and make North Carolina a blue state. It hasn't happened, and it hasn't happened for a reason. The demographic shifts in the parties that we discussed in North Carolina are acute, meaning there just isn't a ton of movement, and it took someone who was as dynamic and who outspent his opponent by as much as Barack Obama did on John McCain to win that state by a little bit. They have a Democratic governor. Republicans haven't nominated the best folks, but to run since 2020 or 2016 rather. They have a supermajority in the state legislature. They just took over a majority on the Supreme Court. I mentioned before the Ted Budd race in 2022 was a snoozer against a pretty good candidate on paper anyway. I just don't think it's winnable for the Democrats.
Of all the states on this list, Justin, Biden's approval is lowest here, and it's lowest by a good margin from the number 2 state on the list. Biden's approval is 32% versus 57% disapprove.
It's brutal. It's brutal. And again, I don't know what it's going to be a year from now, but it's got to over-index it. It's not getting close to that right now. So,
yep, totally agree.
Pennsylvania, what do you think of Pennsylvania, Bill?
I'm bullish on Pennsylvania, Justin. I'll start by saying Biden's approval is just 40%.
Well, I would hope you're bullish. You abandoned your home state of New Jersey to move there. You must really love it.
I can see it from the back. I can see it from the backyard, though. Still, Biden's approval is lower in Pennsylvania than in Ohio. It's lower than in Florida. It is low here, and you say it a lot, and you're completely right. 2020 was a close election. 2020 in Pennsylvania came down to 80,000 votes, and the suburban collar counties won't be worse for Trump than they were in 2020. And well publicized, often discussed, Bucks, Chester, Delaware, and Montgomery. Clinton beat Trump by 188,000 votes in 2016. Biden beat Trump by almost 288,000, 100,000 more. So those numbers were in the dumpster and can't get worse. I think they can get better. And I think there are votes to be regained in other parts of the state as well. Luzerne and Lackawanna County, kind of the Scranton-Wilkes-Barre region of the state, home of Joe Biden. Every time I drive up there, I see the Joe Biden Expressway. It makes me want to turn off and exit early. Those are votes where Biden regained some of what Trump took in 2016. Erie County, opposite side of the state, flipped back from Trump to Biden. A county that's a swing county. But I think there's some places that Trump slipped a bit that I think are probably having some buyer's remorse. On the flip side, Biden underperformed Clinton in the city of Philadelphia by about 26,000 votes. So there are some places for Biden to do better as well. But I think we've talked a lot on this list about some states tilting left over time. Well, in 2020, the Commonwealth voted 3% more Republican than the national average. And this is the second, 16 and 20, the second election in which PA voted to the right of the rest of the nation. And it hadn't done so previous to 16 and 20 since, I think, the 40s. So while Pennsylvania is not nearly Ohio, it's not turning red, it's certainly not a progressive state. And I think that the guts, the mechanics are here for a Trump win.
I agree. It's the same as Michigan in the sense that Biden is going to do worse than he did in terms of the raw number of votes he gets. He's going to underperform probably what he did in 2020 in Pennsylvania. It's probably the same everywhere, but I had just talked about it in Michigan. That's going to manifest itself. It doesn't really matter the region of the state it manifests itself in. You're probably right about the suburbs, but it's probably the same everywhere, right? It's just going to, on the aggregate, on the whole, he's going to underperform his number. The TBD question for me, and I've always wondered this about Pennsylvania, is how much more vote can get squeezed out of those rural counties for Donald Trump. The numbers, except for those suburban numbers that were just a lot of suburban men turning from Biden to Trump, Trump to Biden. He won it by 40. He won the state by 40,000 votes in 2016, lost it by 60 in 2020. The margin you just said in those collar counties was the margin. It was largely men, probably white middle-class men. There'll be some deterioration in that. Everything else stayed pretty static in the rest of the state. In those, Luzerne counties of the world that flipped in 2016, they stayed flipped in 2020. My only other point to add to yours is there more vote that can get squeezed out of the rural counties in Pennsylvania? And how do we do that? How does Donald Trump do that? And one of the things that really hurt with COVID in 2020 was not being able to send President Trump to a lot of places, especially in a lot of states run by Democrats. I mean, we kept going to the same places sending him to the same places over and over and over again. Sending him to places where presidents don't typically go, or presidential campaigns don't typically go, in really rural areas, is something that the campaign should seriously look at, because that, I think, can juice that rural vote just a little bit more. And take that plus the natural deterioration in Biden numbers, and I think Pennsylvania's in play and really, really, really close.
It's a really good point. In 2020, unlike 2016, Trump was kind of hamstrung by the mechanics of being president, right? The size of the airport that Air Force One could land in, the size of the support that would have to come with him. You just couldn't get to Altoona easily. You couldn't get to Erie easily.
Well, they wouldn't let
You
us.
were
They
kinda-
wouldn't let us do anything if we got there anyway.
Yeah.
So there was no point.
Mhm.
It wasn't even the mechanic.
Right,
You could
right.
figure out the mechanics on this stuff if you're the president. Like you can do it. I, they just wouldn't. We couldn't. We kept going to the same airport hangars all over and over again because Wolf shut the state down. It was a real problem.
I'm voting not to discuss Ohio and Florida because, like New Hampshire, they shouldn't be on this list.
Yeah, they're going to vote
One last thing.
overwhelmingly for the Republican nominee for president, and I just like Fox News called Arizona early. I'm calling Ohio and Florida early.
One last state I do want to touch on is Wisconsin.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on Wisconsin?
I think somebody is going to win Wisconsin by 20,000 votes because that's how it goes. And I think it will be entirely dependent on how the economy is doing. And TBD. I'm not either Donald Trump or Joe Biden, assuming they're the nominees, could win Wisconsin. And, same things about rural turnout as we talked about in Pennsylvania and in the cities and stuff like that. But there is just not a huge swing universe, and there's not a lot of people that don't vote in Wisconsin anyway. Somebody's going to win it by 20,000 votes, and I think it's going to be largely dependent on the national environment and the economic environment. What do you think?
Yeah, Ron Johnson won in 2022 by a point, got reelected, Senator Johnson, in a year in which the Democrat governor got reelected. And I bring up Johnson because unlike other states where you had Republicans win statewide in 2022, along with a Democrat also winning statewide in 22, Georgia was, you had Kemp winning re-election, kind of an anti-Trump. You had Sununu winning re-election, an anti-Trump. In Wisconsin, you had Ron Johnson win, who wasn't anti-Trump, right? Re-elected by a point. You had the Democrat governor re-elected by 3. So to me, that tells you that you can win, not running away from Trump. It's a swing state, and I think the pathway exists. I think it is very economic dependent, but the pathway for Trump is he doesn't have to flip counties. That's hard work. It's hard to flip something from red to blue or blue to red. Trump just has to regain some of the slippage he saw around the edges between 16 and 20, famously in the 3 suburban counties. He saw slippage from 19 to 12 in Ozaukee and from 40 to 38 in Washington. Like these are not huge, heavy lifts. These are precinct driven efforts that I think are very achievable, very economic based, as you're saying. Like, what's the economy going to be like? But it's going to come down to thousands of votes.
Yeah.
Yet again.
Yep. I will say this too, and this is particularly acute in Wisconsin, but it's also true in Arizona and Michigan and Nevada and Pennsylvania. The top of the ticket races are going to be extremely close, and anyone running statewide, particularly for Senate, is really going to be able to do some damage given the Republican turnout. And I'm particularly, looking at you, Pennsylvania, looking at you, Arizona, and looking at you, Wisconsin. Do some serious data work on your own. Do your own math on this, because win or lose at the top of the ticket, it's going to be close enough that you're going to be able to find some split ticket voters. Not a ton. You don't need a ton. And surprise some people with some of these races that may not be on the Democrats' radar screen right now. And those are all Republican pickup opportunities. So, but particularly in Wisconsin, that's a really a place where you can do some damage. All right.
I agree.
All right. Well, I think that's all the time we have for this week. Bill, thanks everybody for listening, and we hope you liked it. If you did, please share it with your friends, tell everyone about it, follow us, like us, subscribe, do whatever you got to do, and we'll see you next week. Thanks, everybody.